Welcome back to another episode of the Sew Your Stash series. Today I'm going to show you how I sew my Scrappy Strings block. So here's one of my blocks, and this is what 4 blocks look like together in this pillow. It's really fun to sew because in the blocks you use several different widths of strips, and so none of the seams are supposed to match up, and so it makes it really fun to sew. Now, when my great-grandma made her string blocks, she used newspaper for the back, but I'm using sew-in interfacing. I cut my interfacing 9 inches square, and then after sewing, I'm going to trim it up to 8.5 inches square. Today, I'm working with 1.5 inch strips and 2.5 inch strips. Now let's sew. So you can do one block that's made up of all 1.5 inch strips. This one has a 2.5 inch strip down the center. Sometimes I even do a 3.5 inch strip. This one is made up of 1.5 and 2.5 inch strips, and that's what I'm going to do today. When I'm sewing these, I like to work with 2 blocks at a time, and that way I can always be chain piecing. So I start with my 2 9-inch squares of interfacing, and I find a 1.5 inch strip to go down the center of each one to start with. Now I don't cut the length of my strips beforehand. I just lay it out on the square and trim it off so it's just going past the corners. I don't even iron my strips beforehand. I just grab them from the basket, trim them the length that I need, and then I'm ready to sew. And I'll just do the same thing with this second block as well. If you're worried about your fabric shifting, you could pin if you want. I normally don't. I'm just showing you that you could. I find that the interfacing kind of keeps the fabric from slipping. Okay, so I now have grabbed this 2.5 inch wide strip from my basket, and I'm just going to cut it, not the length of the first strip, but just past the point of the interfacing. And then I'm going to sew them together, right sides together, and I don't use my Seam So Easy guide or anything. I just use the edge of the presser foot. Then I'm just going to go ahead and do the same thing to the second block and run it through right after the first one. Now these blocks are really relaxing to make. They're so easy. There's no rules. The only rule that I have is I try not to put 2 colors right next to each other. So each time that I add a new strip, I press the seam toward the strip that I just added, and now it's time to add one to the other side. So I just dip into my 2.5 inch strip basket again, and this one, wow, lines up perfectly. I just want to make sure the fabric either goes right to the edge of the interfacing because we'll be trimming off, or it goes over a little bit. So this is basically how I sew my Scrappy Strings blocks. I start with a 1.5 inch strip in the center, or a 2.5 inch strip, or a 3.5 inch strip, and then I just build from the center out on both sides, sewing 2 blocks at the same time. I love this block because it's a great way to play with my Scrappy Strips baskets and, you know, use all of those fun leftovers and new fabrics that I've added. String blocks were something that my great-grandmother did, and she made these blocks to use up all of the leftover fabrics from even very thin strips from sewing clothing and, of course, making quilts. I'm sure string blocks were something that your great-grandmothers sewed as well. Now I'm getting down to shorter strips here, and you see that in the bowl that I have shorter strips that I've added there as I've trimmed from the longer strips. If they're short, I just throw them in the bowl, and then hopefully as I get towards the end here, I can just grab from that bowl. I keep the bowl handy here by my sewing machine so that I go to those first without having to go into the longer strips so that I can use the short strips up. Now, in the opening of the video, you saw my design wall where I have a lot of these blocks already made and ready to sew together. They're just pinned to the design wall. They're not sewn together yet. But when I sew them together, I like to do it in that pattern, but you can always turn them different ways if you'd like and just play with it. And like I said before, one of my very favorite things about sewing this block is because I'm using different widths of fabrics, that when you sew the blocks together, none of the seams are supposed to line up, and they don't line up, and that makes it worry-free. Okay, so now I'm getting to the point where I just have this little triangles left on the sides, and I'm going to just grab a 2.5 inch strip and use those to cover. I want to use a 2.5 inch strip just to make sure that when I sew and then flip it over, it's going to cover that corner completely. Depending on what different widths that you used when you're making your blocks, sometimes you may need a 3.5 inch strip, or you can do two 1.5 inch strip. The point is you just need to cover the corner so that when you trim up the blocks, you have fabric there and not just interfacing left. Okay, now that all the corners are done, we'll take them over and give both blocks a quick press, and then we'll go over and trim them up to 8.5 inches square. So as soon as I get these trimmed up, I can add 2 more blocks to my vintage enamel pan here. This is where I keep all of my blocks stacked up until I'm ready to put the whole quilt together. Now when I'm trimming, I lay my ruler on my interfacing on the back side, not the front, so that I can see exactly what I'm trimming off. And I just center it the best as I can, just eyeball it. You don't really have to be exactly centered. You just want to make sure that you have interfacing within that 8.5 inch square. Now, of course, you can make your Scrappy Strings blocks whatever size you want. I've made many different sizes. Just make sure that you cut your interfacing a 1/2 inch bigger than what you're going to be trimming up your block. Now, I also wanted to tell you that I do, of course, leave the interfacing in. And the quilts that I make, I don't use batting. I just use the interfacing and go ahead and back it and quilt it, and it really makes a lovely quilt that can just be cuddled up with. Now, of course, you could always use batting as well as leaving the interfacing in. It would just be a little bit thicker quilt, and there's nothing wrong with that either. It just depends on what you're using it for. I hope you've enjoyed my Scrappy Strings tutorial, and I'll chat with you next week.